to to a summer session, I guess. Um, yeah, I guess we need to get started. Today we're talking about contemporary uh, theories as to why abnormal behavior occurs, and then the other one is about assessment and diagnosis. So let's go ahead and get started. Um, okay, let's go ahead and get started, he said. There we go. Okay. Contemporary frameworks. We're going to start off with a biological theory. Since most of the first psychologists started out as medical doctors, this has included Freud, and we're going to talk about some of those first theorists. The biological explanation for mental illness has been the oldest and longest enduring perspective in psychology. And of course, in medicine, you're looking for patients because patients have something wrong with them, and you need to help them. You need to try to alleviate their problems, and of course, that's the way the first psychologist dealt with mental illness. The biological model adopts the nomenclature of medicine, and therefore the sufferer is referred to as a patient, and the problem began as a disease with symptoms. The basic structure of the medical model is the neuron. The neuron is the structure of communication throughout the nervous system. The neuron not only coordinates all movement and responses, but all thought as well. All neurons have the same basic structure. The portion of the neuron that provides for the care and maintenance of the neuron is the soma, which contains the nucleus. And we see this is the soma right here, the soma, the axon, and these are the dendrites that collect the information. Information is collected by the short fibrous projections from the soma called the dendrites, which look like the branches of a tree. In the dendrites, if the dendrites are the branches, then the axon, of course, is the trunk. Information is collected by the dendrites, passes through the soma into the axon, to the axon terminal, where the information is passed on to another neuron, an organ, or a muscle. At the axon terminal, most neurons branch to pass on more information. Sorry, I needed a drink. Each branch of axon ends in a swelling called the knob. Knobs do not touch the receiving neuron or organ, but have an open area between themselves and the other structure known as a synaptic cleft. Communication is achieved between the two areas through a synapse. Information is passed to the open synaptic cleft by chemicals known as neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters pass between the two structures and are gathered in areas on the receiving structure called the receptor sites. The reception of the neurotransmitter causes a chemical imbalance to occur in the receiving structure, creating an electrical reaction. Not all the neurotransmitter released into the synaptic cleft is needed or will be used. In order for the neuron to go back to the resting state, the neurotransmitter must be taken out of the synapse. This is done in one of two ways. The neurotransmitter is broken down by an enzyme, or the neurotransmitter is taken back into the discharging axon knob through a process known as reuptake. Neurotransmitters can either be excitatory or inhibitory. Abnormally low or high levels of select neurotransmitters are present in select instances of abnormal behavior. Acetylcholine, which controls muscle contraction and is present in the memory formation, the death of acetylcholine producing cells in the brain lead to Alzheimer's disease. Dopamine regulates muscle contractions in the body and maintains learning, memory, and emotions in the brain. Excess amounts of dopamine is implicated in the development of schizophrenia. Too much dopamine means schizophrenia. In many cases, schizophrenia can be alleviated by giving the individual medication that blocks dopamine receptor sites. Norepinephrine aids in learning and memory. Excess amounts can lead to mania, while decreased amounts leads to some forms of depression. Serotonin regulates moods, communicates satiation, and regulates sleep. Reduced serotonin leads to depression and eating disorders. The main focus of abnormal behavior is the central nervous system made up of the brain and the spinal cord. The portion of the brain closest to the spinal cord is the hindbrain. The hindbrain is comprised of the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. The medulla regulates heart rate, respiration, blood pressure, sneezing, sleep, and coughing. The pons controls body movement, attention, sleep, and respiration. The cerebellum regulates muscle tone, balance, and coordination. The midbrain is a pathway between the hindbrain and the forebrain. One system that runs through all three areas of the brain is the reticular activating system, or the RAS. The reticular activating system plays a role in sleep, attention, and arousal. Injury to this area will lead the individual to a state of unconsciousness, and this is what is known as comatose. And usually, the injury to the area has to do with a bruise. It has to do with swelling in the area, and this is one of the reasons why people become comatose, is because there is swelling along the RAS, and the coma will continue until the swelling is decreased. Why is there swelling? There's swelling because it's trying to protect that area of the brain. And the swelling will continue as long as the damage is being detected by the cells in the area. They fill up with fluid and try to protect it. So that's one of the reasons why people will go into they will damage their heads. And they'll go into a coma, and it will sometimes take them weeks before they come out of it. And sometimes they never do. The forebrain is made up of the cerebrum, the thalamus, hypothalamus, limbic system, and the basal ganglia. The thalamus is involved in sleep and attention and relays sensory information to other parts of the brain. The thalamus, hypothalamus, amygdala, and hippocampus make up the limbic system. And that is right in the middle of the brain. And there's your thalamus right there. It's also in the middle of your brain. The hypothalamus is the most important gland in the body, located between the thalamus and the pituitary. It controls the regulation of body temperature, concentration of fluids, storage of nutrients, motivation, hunger, thirst, sex, parenting, and aggression, and emotions. This tiny structure right here in the middle of the brain. The outer surface of the cerebrum is where all the higher order thinking takes place. This is known as the cerebral cortex. It's called a cortex because cortex is Latin for bark. Connecting the two hemispheres of the brain is a thick fiber called the corpus callosum. And this doesn't show the corpus callosum. Yeah, there it is. That's it right there. Corpus callosum. Chromosomes are elongated bodies and cells that carry genetic information. There are 23 pairs of chromosomes in human body cells. Genes are units of hereditary information carried in a chromosome by DNA. Alleles are alternate forms of genes. A person's genotype is a total set of inherited characteristics determined by a person's genetic makeup. A person's phenotype is the observable characteristics that result from the interaction between genotype and environmental influences. Phenotypes are the observable genes, and the genotype is normally unexpressed. This gets really confusing until you start looking at these things. One of the things that I used to do when I was a laboratory technician back 30 or 40 years ago was I used to do blood typing, or not blood typing, but cross matching, cross matching. And one of the things that you had to do was to see if the two um, blood, if you the blood that the individual had and the blood that you were giving them, you needed to mix them together and make sure that there wasn't going to be a reaction. Well, sometimes you could type somebody's blood, somebody's AB negative or whatever, and sometimes when you type their blood and you mixed it with another exact type, AB negative and AB negative, you get a reaction to it. And one of the reasons that you got a reaction was because of the hidden factors. And the hidden factors were known as the genotypes. That was part of the genotype. Um, some people had interesting mutations in their blood, and for that reason, they were difficult to type. They were difficult to find donors for that select individual. It's not all that common. Most of us are O's, and most of us are positives. O positive. I'm an O positive, and probably you're an O positive as well. Different groups of individuals tend to have the same type of blood, and one of the known factors of the Dene people is that most of you guys are O positive. Actually, there's a lot of people in the world who are O positive, including me, as I said before. About 30% of the world's population are O positive. So there you go. Congratulations. You guys have a very common type of blood. And in the physiological psychology class, I break it down because that's really interesting to me. But I won't be teaching that class anymore, so we'll see what happens. We'll see what kind of information you get from your new instructors. There are two types of twins: identical twins and fraternal twins, of course. The identical twins are known as monozygotic. They only have one zygote, mono meaning singular. This results in the splitting of a single fertilized ovum. The twins have the same genetics. We do have identical twins in my family. My great, wait a minute. Yeah, my great grandfather was a twin, and my great grandmother was a twin. Is that right? My great grandfather and my grandmother were twins on my father's side. There you go. Ah, my great grandfather fought in the Civil War, and his identical twin. They were both blacksmiths, and they were both in the Western Campaign. And one of them was captured at Chickamauga, which is just north of Atlanta, and he was imprisoned at Andersonville, the famous prison, Southern prison, and died there, actually. His name was Wilson. His first name was Wilson, Wilson Hayden, and my great grandfather's name was Benjamin Hayden. And Benjamin Hayden had a set of identical twins named Dora and Nora. And my grandmother's name was Nora. I think she was Nora. I'm pretty sure she was Nora. Anyway, identical twins in my family. Um, Fraternal twins are dizygotic twins. In other words, the individual produces two ova at the same time, and both of them are impregnated, and they grow, uh, usually separately in separately in the womb, but it's simultaneous fertilization. So fraternal twins can be different genders, for example. Identical twins are always the same gender. They have to be the same gender, males and or females. It is assumed that the differences in degree of behavioral similarity between identical and fraternal twins will be largely due to the greater genetic similarity of the identical twins, given that both monozygotic and dizygotic twins share roughly equal environments. And of course, that zygote, well, I don't know what I was thinking about that. Another method of assessing genetic influence is to compare children who have been removed from their biological parents at or shortly after birth and adopted or raised by foster parents. If an adoptee is more like the adopting parents than the biological parents, we infer environmental influences. If the adoptee is more like the biological parent than the adoptive parents, we infer genetic influences. And we've been looking at this for decades, or for over 100 years. Now this becomes really important because how if you adopt a child or have a surrogate child, uh, what is the possibility that they're going to act like you? And these figures have been going up and down for decades. The last I read was it's about 80-20. Genetics is about 20%. They act like their adoptive parent, and 80% is environmental. So if you adopt a child, the probability that they're going to act like you is 80%. For most behavioral traits, genes may account for about half of the variability between people, while our environmental factors account for the other half. And of course, that's the new figures are a little bit different from that. Calculations of heritability. Normally, people are raised in the same environment with their biological parents, and for that reason, people want to think that they've inherited all the good traits, and they have lost all the bad traits. But of course, that's not always the case. Calculations of heritability do not tell us to what extent either genetics or environment causes a trait, nor whether any individual will develop the trait because the biological traits are influenced by both genetic and environmental factors. Phenylketonuria is a waste product of protein metabolism that builds up and causes brain damage to infants who do not have the normal enzyme to break it down. Phenylketonuria, it's a waste product. One of the things I did when I was working as a laboratory technician, one of the first things I did was have to draw blood from babies. And what we were looking for was phenylketonuria. We were looking for an excess amount of this waste product. If we found that, we had to put the baby on a special diet. So a couple days after the baby was born, after it had its first diet of protein, milk of one form or another, then we had to draw the baby's blood to make sure that it didn't have an excess amount of this waste product, because this waste product is a waste product and it will sit in the brain, it will destroy brain cells. And it used to be the major cause of dis, intellectual disability in infants. But since it's measured all over the United States, now we catch these before the child is damaged. Biological treatments are an attempt to address assumed underlying biological causes. There are convulsive therapies, psychosurgery, and psychopharmacology. Early in the 1800s, observations were noted that mentally disturbed people showed improvement in their symptoms after recovering from a convulsion. In recent decades, electroconvulsive therapy has been restricted almost entirely to serious mood disorders, usually depression. Uh, Electroconvulsive therapy is more effective in the short term than antidepressant medications in a treatment of severe depression. Magnetic seizure therapy is therapy that there is stimulation of brain regions using magnetic fields at sufficient strength to result in convulsions. Repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation is therapy that uses repeated magnetic pulses at sub-seizure levels of intensity. It is promising but not as effective as ECT. They're trying to control mostly depressive symptoms. Vagus nerve stimulation has been approved by the FDA for use with treatment-resistant depression. Vagus nerve stimulation uses implanted electrodes in specific brain areas to stimulate the vagus nerve, and that controls depression. Frontal lobotomy is a procedure from about 1935 of separating the frontal lobes from the deeper parts of the brain as a treatment for violent, agitated, depressed, or dangerous patients. Although only about one-third of his subjects improved, Antonio Moniz was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1949 for developing the procedure, and this is Moniz right here. Psychosurgery remains an experimental practice and is not a part of standard biological treatment at the present. Frontal lobotomies. The focus in the use of drugs which impact neurotransmission in the brain is known as psychopharmacology. Over 11% of American adults received psychotropic medications in 2002. The drug revolution has resulted in symptom relief, but none of the medications correct or resolve the biological condition presumed to underlie the symptoms. In other words, we're treating the symptoms, but we're not treating the cause through the medications. So if we look at psychology, one of the things we see is trying to relieve symptoms, trying to take away the symptoms to make the person act more normally or to be more normal. And so this is one of the reasons why in last week's lecture we talked about normal and abnormal. What is normal and what is abnormal? And society determines what normal and abnormal is. So normal and abnormal in India is not the same as normal and abnormal in the United States. Normal and abnormal in England and in Europe may be completely different from what it is in the United States. In some in Africa, it's the same way. Nothing is universal. There are no universal problems. Well, schizophrenia kind of is a universal problem. But other places determine things a little bit differently than we do. I'm talking about people in the United States. It may be that the people on the Navajo Nation see things a little bit differently. Maybe it's the fact that you have taboos that are not recognized in the general public in the United States. And that's normal and abnormal that we're talking about. Would you throw drugs at somebody that had a problem? And that's the other question that you have to face. If somebody has excess anxiety, do you treat them with Xanax? If somebody has depression, do you throw SSRIs at them? Zoloft, Paxil? That's the question. Before 1900, alcohol, heroin, cocaine, and various other sedative, hypnotic, and stimulant substances were used as treatments for mental disorders. By 1950, benzedrine and amphetamine had been used for hyperactivity, and lithium salts had been used to treat mania. Antipsychotic and antidepressant drugs were developed in the 1950s, when reductions in psychological symptoms were noted after the use of antihistamine and tuberculosis medications, respectively. In other words, they were trying to treat something else, and they noticed that their psychological symptoms had changed. The revolutionary development of antipsychotic and antidepressant medications also led to the development of biological theories of the disorders they treat. The dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia purports that the disorder is caused by excessive dopamine activity in the brain. The catecholamine hypothesis of depression purports that the mood disorder resulted from a relative depletion of norepinephrine in the brain. There are significant concerns about psychotropic medication side effects. Tardive dyskinesia is the occasional long-term side effect of phenothiazine treatment of schizophrenia, involving rhythmically stereotyped movements and lip smacking. Granulocytosis is a potentially fatal blood disease associated with the use of newer antipsychotic medications. Additional medications are frequently prescribed to help patients control the side effects of psychotropic medications. Relapse is high once medications are discontinued. Therefore, when you start on a psychotropic medication, whether it's for anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, if you put somebody on medication, the probability is that you can't take them off. And the reason you can't take them off is because their bodies get used to that. This is normal for them. Suddenly, their normal behavior is more important than the physical symptoms. And because they have physically changed, their body has physically changed. If you take them off, their symptoms come back exacerbated. They come back much worse. And for that reason, you can't take somebody off cold turkey if they're on any medication. That includes SSRIs. Not quite as severe, but anxiety is the psycho the psychoanxiolytics, um, the drugs that you give somebody for anxiety. If you take them off cold turkey, their anxiety comes back many times worse. Uh-oh. So what are we doing? What are we doing? Why should we treat these people with these drugs? Well, we're trying to make them feel normal. And the drugs actually work. They do make them feel normal. It just changes their biochemical structure just a little bit. Enough for so that they can't ever go off of them again. The earliest model developed, and this is one of the problems with treating drugs with marijuana or with, what are we treating them with? Magic mushrooms. Yeah, I mean, you treat anybody with anything, and potentially you're changing the biochemical structure of their bodies. And if you change the biochemical structure of their body, you can't really go back. You can, I mean, you can wean them off of those drugs, but very frequently their symptoms come back. So I'm taking high blood pressure medication. And the probability is that I'll be taking high blood pressure medication for the rest of my life. Will it kill me? Well, it's possible that the biochemical changes that it creates in my body will shorten my life. That's a possibility. So a lot of times we treat people with medications, and those medications do actually shorten people's lives. And this can be a really serious problem as far as doctors are concerned, because doctors are trying to prolong people's lives. So any medication you take can potentially do damage. Most medications are toxins, and because they're toxins, the human body has to deal with them. They have to get rid of them. And they get rid of them through your kidneys and your liver. Now, I'm not saying don't take any medications, not at all. If it helps, you need to take it. But there is a probability that you will be actually shortening your life with some medications. Just like alcohol. Alcohol, we just use alcohol as a medication. But it can shorten people's lives. And marijuana is the same way. What did they say? Greater probability of cancer, greater probability of heart disease with marijuana. New study came out. Wasn't very long ago. It was like 2 weeks ago. Anyway, so anything that you do, anything that you put in your body might potentially lower your life. If you drink water and eat, I don't know what you're going to eat, lettuce, and that's all you eat, you're probably going to be okay. But we have learned that if you consume too much sugar, then a lot of times what happens is you develop diabetes. This is something that you put in your body, and you've got to think about these things. That's why we want people to eat healthy. The more strange things that you consume, the greater the probability that that's whatever that strange thing is going to cause you problems. Ultra processed foods. We've been talking about ultra processed foods for about 30 years. Anyway, developed by Sigmund Freud and his colleagues at the end of the 19th. So what are we talking about? A psychodynamic model. Developed by the Sigmund Freud and his colleagues at the end of the 19th century, psychoanalysis view present mental problems as being caused by internal unconscious problems from the individual's development. Because the cause is unconscious, to get to the root cause of the patient's problem takes a great deal of therapy and careful observation by the therapist. Freud's theories evolved during a time of a great deal of sexual repression in Europe. Therefore, Freud saw most of humanity's problems caused by sexual repression. He was very much influenced by the work of Charles Darwin. He therefore saw humanity's need to reproduce, just as in any other animal, as our prime driving force. Abnormality was caused when the normal sexual drive got in the way of the social convictions, forcing the individual to either do something that would be frowned on by social conventions or deny their sexual needs. In most cases, the sexual needs are repressed and the individual develops some form of pathology, usually a neuroses. Freud felt that each of us is born with our animal reproductive needs. This drive Freud called the id, which is Latin for it. Id is the Latin word for it. The id is made up of instinctual needs, drives, and impulses. The id's focus is obtaining whatever it wants. It's an animal drive. This is done through the pleasure principle. If it feels good, do it. The drive that fuels us is sexual energy or our libido. The libido will fuel our drive the rest of our lives. The libido fuels the id through the initial stage of life, a stage that focuses on eating, and this is known as the oral stage. At about 18 months of life, social necessity forces the parent to force the child into learning social responsibility and potty training. At this point, the ego must be developed. The ego is our unconscious drive to gain social responsibility through the reality principle. Our first socially responsible act is potty training. Thus, our developmental focus is with the depositing our solid and liquid, and mostly our solid waste, in an appropriate receptacle. The anus is our second area of focus, and thus the anal stage is our next stage of development. The ego works by controlling the id's libido through the ego defense mechanisms. Repression is avoiding anxiety by not allowing painful or dangerous thoughts to become conscious. That's repression. So we will repress these sexual thoughts. Denial, refusing to acknowledge the existence of an external source of anxiety. Projection, attributing your own unacceptable impulses, motives, or desires to other people. Rationalization, intellectualizing a social acceptable reason for an action that actually reflects unacceptable desires, rationalization. Reaction formation, adopting behavior that is the exact opposite of impulses they are afraid to acknowledge. Displacement, displacing hostility away from a dangerous object and onto a safer substitute. Intellectualization or detachment, individual suppresses emotional reaction by giving a flat, emotionless, overly logical response. Regression, retreating from an upsetting conflict by reacting in a more immature manner than your age, going back to a safer developmental stage. Sublimation, expressing sexual and aggressive energy in ways that are acceptable to society. I got stories for all of these. Between ages 3 and 5, after we become potty trained, our area of focus becomes our sexual parts. This stage of development is the phallic or penis stage. During this stage, males go through the Oedipal conflict and females go through the Electra conflict. In this conflict, the child desires to control their opposite sex parent. This is resolved by accepting the inability to compete with the same sex parent and thus identifying with the same sex parent. This is known as resolving the Oedipal conflict and results in development of the superego. Because a child is now adopting parents' values through identification with the same sex parent, the superego is able to develop. The child will resolve the Oedipal conflict at about age 5 and pass into a period where there is little going on sexually, and this is known as the latency stage that lasts through age 12 when puberty takes place. Puberty triggers the individual's desire to have sex with the opposite sex since they identify with their same sex parent, and they go into the genital stage. Freud felt that thought and memory that we could recall only amounted to about 10% of our total mind structure. The rest lay hidden into a rarely tapped mass known as the collective unconscious. So if you can imagine all the thoughts that you've ever had, most of them you can't remember. Sometimes something will make you remember something. You go, oh yeah, when I was 3, I remember doing that. Most of that information is hidden somewhere in your brain. And Freud felt that 90% of it was your collective unconscious, this portion that you can't really remember. You can find those memories sometimes, but sometimes you can't. To get glimpses into the collective unconscious, Freud relied on talking therapy, where hints of the unconscious would come out. The talking therapy that Freud used was free association, where Freud would allow the client to say anything that came into their head with minimal prompting from the therapist. In fact, the client faced away from the therapist to prevent any interruptions. A second technique was dream analysis, where the therapist interpreted the client's dreams. Dreams were unsuppressed glimpses into the unconscious. Psychoanalysis often takes years because of the resistance to the form of ego defense mechanisms that client used to stay away from unpleasant thoughts. Now, we saw all of these: rationalization, denial, repression, denial, projection, reaction formation, displacement, sublimation, regression, intellectualization. These are the defense mechanisms that we use. And we form resistances using these defense mechanisms. The client will begin the recovery process by beginning to feel toward their therapist the way that they feel toward their significant other. And this is usually their parent that they are in conflict with. And that's usually the mother or the father. It can be a grandparent that has caused the problem, whoever is the dynamic person in their life. And this is known as transference. As they relieve the conflict that is causing them problems, the therapist can relieve the conflict because the client has transferred their feelings from the conflictual person to the therapist. This relieving of the conflict is known as catharsis. The process of dealing with conflict and catharses in a person's life is known as working through a conflict. Carl Jung was a contemporary of Freud's, but felt that the human mind maintained human ideals called archetypes and a memory of the individual's ancestry in the collective unconscious. And part of these archetypes is an all-powerful God. Now, the interesting thing is that Jung was part of this Wednesday night circle that Freud had established. Almost everybody in the circle was Jewish. They were all doctors. And then Carl Jung showed up wanting to study with Freud, but Carl Jung was Swiss. He was not from Austria like all of the other people in the Wednesday night circle. Not only was he Swiss, but he was also not Jewish. He was from the Swiss Reform. His father was a Swiss Reformed minister, so he was a Christian. Everybody else was Jewish, and for that reason, he stood out like a sore thumb. But in this case, he stood out like a golden child, and Freud tapped him to be the next leader of the Wednesday night circle, because Freud was, for one thing, he wasn't a doctor, so he could concentrate on all the psychological things, whereas everybody else were brain surgeons and they had to do medical things all the time. Jung could concentrate on psychology. So Jung was a lot different from everybody else, and he was a very handsome man. Freud was a very handsome man, and there and this all became conflictual. Eventually, this became conflictual. So, and we'll get into some of the conflict in just a second. But his archetypes were an all-powerful God, a fertile and nurturing mother, a young hero, a wise old man, and themes of rebirth and resurrection, which is right out of the New Testament. You know, the all-powerful God. You know, Mother Mary. The young hero was Jesus, of course. The wise old man was Moses, and of course, the theme of rebirth and resurrection. Now, rebirth and resurrection isn't in the Jewish Bible. The Jewish Bible is just the Old Testament, and there is no resurrection in the Old Testament, but there is in the New Testament. And of course, Jung was the son of a Swiss Reformed Church minister. Now, one of the things you need to recognize when I say Reformed Church, a lot of times, and especially in Europe, Reformed meant that they went back to the old ways of thinking. So if we have a Dutch Reformed Church, it's more evangelical. It's more. It goes back to the old ideas, and so anything that's a Reformed Church is usually a little bit more strict. And that was Carl Jung. And I'm showing you a picture of Karen Horney. Karen Horney was the only female in the group. And this is a picture of Karen Horney. And as you can see, she was a very attractive woman. Freud told everybody to leave her alone. You know, everybody's trying to hit on her. And he told everybody to leave her alone. And what eventually happened, what eventually happened was Carl Jung had an affair with Karen Horney. And that is what broke up the Wednesday night circle. Usually when you're talking about the early psychologists, we talk about Karen Horney because she had her own way of looking at things. It was little bit different than Freud's, and a little bit different than Jung's, and a little bit different than Adler's. But she kind of broke things up. She was a very attractive lady. Her daughter became an actress, but this was during World War II. It gets real messy after that. Anyway, okay. So another contemporary of Freud's was Alfred Adler, the ugly little man with one leg shorter than the other. Alfred Adler was also a contemporary of Freud's, but felt that each individual had a built-in sense of inferiority due to their size when they were young and forced subordination because they were so young. It was because of this feeling of inferiority, the inferiority complex, that drives people to succeed and dissipate the negative feelings through the creative self. Ugly little man, short. He was a little short fella, and one leg was shorter than the other. So, as far as he was concerned, this was the most important aspect. This inferiority complex drove the individual to succeed. Remember, Freud thought it was sexual repression. Jung thought it was your recognizing your ancestry, these archetypes, this collective unconscious. And then Adler thinks it's an inferiority complex. Erik Erikson was also a contemporary of Freud's, but felt that it was social pressure that drove people to change and eventually succeed in life. Erikson saw society creating episodes of crisis at select stages in an individual's life that forced them to accept the responsibility of infancy, toddlerhood, childhood, adolescence, and finally adulthood. What do we know about Erik Erikson? Erik Erikson was not born Erik Erikson. Erik Erikson's mother had an affair with a Danish sea captain, and when Erik was born, she was married to a Jewish man. Jewish people tend to have dark hair and have curly hair. Erik Erikson was born blonde-headed with straight hair. And it was fairly obvious to the father that he was not his child, to the extent that he divorced her almost immediately as soon as Erik was born. I'm trying to think what his name was. His name was Erik. Anyway, she eventually married his pediatrician, and his name was Holmberger. And so Erik's first uh, father, or the father that he recognized, the person that he thought was his father, was the individual she was married to at the time. And then, of course, she married Holmberger, and he raised Erik Erikson. And then, when he was 16 years old and about to graduate from high school, his mother told him, no, this guy was not your father, and the pediatrician was not your biological father. It was this Danish sea captain. All throughout Erikson's life, because he looked Aryan, because he looked German, and because he was Jewish, Germans rejected him and Jewish people rejected him. He looked too German to mess with. As far as the Jewish people were concerned, he was Jewish, so the Germans rejected him as well. So there was nobody that accepted him except his mother, of course. Mothers don't reject their children. So his life was a life of crisis. And for that reason, he thought that social crisis was the essence of life. And this is what you needed to focus on. And that's why he came up with what he did. How about that? So at 16, he dropped out of high school and started wandering around Europe looking for his biological father. He never found his biological father, by the way, but he ended up in all these seaports around Europe, and in Rome. He was looking for a job, and he found a job at the original Montessori school. So he had those skills behind him when he went to Vienna. And when he went to Vienna, he met Freud's daughter, who was working with children. And because Erikson had worked at the Montessori school, he was ideal for her research. And they started working with children, he and Anna Freud. And when the Nazi movement hit Europe, Erickson decided that he would leave because he was Jewish. And he came to the United States. His name was still Holmberger, by the way. And while he was on the ship coming to the United States, he decided that Holmberger was not shouldn't be his name. It should be, since he had given birth to himself, his new self. He would call him Eric, son of himself, Eric Erickson. That's how he came up with the name Eric Erickson. Eric Erickson. As curious as all that is. And all of this is important. Adler had a problem. His one leg was shorter than the other. He was an ugly little man, and so inferiority was really important to him. We won't go into that. Carl Jung was a product of the Swiss Reformed Church, and for that reason, a lot of his psychology seems to deal with a religious structure. Freud was living in a time when sexual repression was massive all over Europe, so that became the focus of his psychology. Behaviorism is an approach. Okay, so that's Europe. At the same time, in the United States and Russia, strangely enough, we were trying to control people's behavior. We were trying to make them better workers. That's what we were trying to do. That's what we were trying to do. The Russians were just trying to figure out how to control people. Behaviorism is an approach to understanding behavior that emphasizes the relationship between observable behavior and specifiable environmental events or stimuli. An underlying assumption is that the principles of conditioning could explain all behavior, both normal and abnormal. There are two schools of behaviorism. One is classical or Pavlovian conditioning, and the other is operant conditioning. So the Pavlovian conditioning came out of Russia. Operant conditioning came out of the United States. The concept of classical conditioning was developed at the turn of the 20th century by Ivan Pavlov, and later it was adopted by the psychologist John B. Watson. He was from Johns Hopkins University. The idea behind behaviorism is that through training or conditioning, a therapist can teach a client to repair any appropriate behavior. Behavior can be changed by watching someone else perform the correct behavior and is known as modeling. Classical conditioning is defined as a conditioned response to a neutral stimulus after having been paired repeatedly with an unconditioned stimulus. This response is, of course, involuntary. Pavlov classical conditioning. Ivan Pavlov organized and directed research in physiology of the Institute of Experimental Medicine at St. Petersburg in Russia in 1891 until his death 45 years later. The Institute of Experimental Medicine is where he conducted his classic experiments on the physiology of digestion, which won him a Nobel Prize in 1904. So he won a Nobel Prize in medicine with his studies, but he was looking at digestion. But what he developed was classical conditioning through his experiments with digestion. Unconditioned response that occurs naturally, such as natural salivation. When you see food, you start salivating. An unconditioned stimulus is stimulus that naturally evokes the response. So when you see food, when you smell food, you naturally salivate. Those are the unconditioned stimulus is the food, and the unconditioned response is the salivation. Conditioned stimulus is stimulus that is learned to associate with the unconditioned stimulus. And in this case, Pavlov used a bell or a tone. He would ring the bell when he fed the dogs. So the dogs, when they heard the bell, they started salivating because they knew they were going to get food. A conditioned response is same as or similar to the unconditioned response. So because they started salivating when they heard the tone, this became a conditioned response. Whether he fed them or not, if he rang the bell, they would start salivating. And then it became a conditioned response through the conditioned stimulus, which was the ringing of the bell. And this is the joke, of course. Watch out! Watch what I can make Pavlov do. As soon as I drool, he'll smile and write in his little book. And this is actually what the experiment was. He used dogs. He had a tube in their stomachs to determine how much salivation was taking place. So he would ring the bell. He tied the food with the ringing of the bell. So every time that he fed the dog, he rang a bell. Pretty soon he could ring the bell and make the dog salivate. That's the classical conditioning. Another type of behavioral conditioning is called operant conditioning. Whereas in classical conditioning, the scientist is tying a wanted response to an automatic response, ringing the bell and salivation. In operant conditioning, the subject is responding in the wanted way because the scientist is rewarding the new behavior. Using operant conditioning, a scientist or a trainer can train anyone to do practically anything. In operant conditioning, reinforcement is a consequence that strengthens or increases the likelihood that a response will be repeated. Primary reinforcers are events usually biological in nature, which almost always provide reinforcement. Punishment is consequences that weakens or decreases the likelihood that a response will be repeated. Punishers are types of consequences that weaken consequences. Punishers are types of consequences that weaken or suppress the behaviors that produce them. Consequences can be further organized as to whether the behavioral contingency involves the presentation or removal of something. Positive reinforcement is where a stimulus is added as the consequence of a behavior. Negative reinforcement is where a stimulus is removed as the consequence of a behavior. Discriminative stimulus serves as a signal that a certain response will lead to a reinforcer or a punisher. The organism learns to not only make a response, but to only make it under certain circumstances. Stop the car in the presence of a red light on the traffic signal, continue forward in the presence of a green light. Discriminative stimuli serve to guide our actions. Abnormal behavior is shaped because it produces reinforcing consequences. Abnormal behavior should be subject to unlearning if the setting conditions and consequences are appropriately changed. The contingencies that maintain a behavior can be shown through the use of a reversal design. Reversal design is an experimental design in which reinforcement contingencies are changed, reinstated, and changed again, attempting to demonstrate the contingencies that maintain a behavior. In other words, in operant conditioning, and when looking at abnormal behavior, they think that there is a positive consequence that occurs because of the abnormal behavior. So what they try to determine is what are the consequences of the behavior? Why is the behavior occurring? Are you trying to control a situation? And that's the way that they look at abnormal behavior. You have been conditioned to act like this. Systematic desensitization is a conditioning method whereby an unwanted behavior is changed by incrementally introducing the unwanted stimulus with controlling the emotional response through relaxation therapy. Practically any unwanted response can be changed through this method either by using reward or using punishment. The cognitive model is based on the idea that abnormal or dysfunctional behavior is caused by incorrect thought or emotional processes, the cognitive processes. The two pioneers of cognitive therapy are Aaron Beck, cognitive therapy, and Albert Ellis, rational emotive therapy. These two approaches are based on the same premise that people become dysfunctional through assumptions and attitudes that are inaccurate. These assumptions and attitudes are supported through illogical thinking processes. To the cognitive therapist, abnormal behavior occurs because people maintain illogical ideas upon which they fixate. Therapy involves pointing out these illogical thoughts and forming new, more functional ways of thinking. The therapist guides the client and challenges the negative thoughts, biased interpretations, and errors in logic that fill their thinking in maintaining new positive ways of living their daily lives. And this is cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. The humanistic existential model feels that humans are born with a natural tendency to be friendly, cooperative, and constructive. In other words, humans strive for individuality. Society, on the other hand, tries to force people into a general mold where these attributes are defined using society's norms, not the individual's needs. For the existentialists, the epitome of societal manipulation is war, where the individual is destroyed functioning for the group, and mechanization, where the individual is trivialized and alienated for the good of the masses. Humanists feel that an individual should be supported in reaching their individual potential or self actualized. A similar concept in existentialism is the idea of making your life meaningful to you by being your authentic self. In life, we either live lives of freedom and give meaning to our lives, or we allow society to define us and shrink from our individual responsibility. People who allow society to define them may live empty, inauthentic, and dysfunctional lives. Carl Rogers developed a type of therapy based on the humanistic model called client centered therapy. Now it's called person centered therapy, by the way. Initially, it was called patient centered therapy. Um, this is what I learned back in the 70s. I was trained in Rogerian therapy, and back then I think we had moved from patient to client. Uh, but I mean, they talked about it all the time. And now, of course, it's person centered therapy because you're not trying to, you don't want them to be uh, abnormal. Don't want to treat them as abnormal. The therapy seeks to bring out naturally friendly, cooperative, and constructive person in its clients by giving them something that society, in its constant competition, may have denied them. And this is known as unconditional positive regard. Unconditional positive regard is non judgmental, good feelings for the individual, something that children don't always get from their parents, but they should. They should get, no matter what the child does, they should always get love or unconditional positive regard from their parents. Because parents so often put conditions on their love for their children, good behavior, good grades, athletic prowess, the individual may doubt their worth because of the conditions of worth placed on them. Because of this distorted view of self worth imposed on them by their parents, dysfunctional people participate in constant self deceptions. I am not good unless I win at everything. That keeps them from becoming self actualized, reaching and recognizing their authentic potential. Therapists who use Rogers client centered therapy try to create a supportive climate in which clients feel able to look at themselves honestly and acceptingly. The therapist's job is to display the proper qualities during therapy: unconditional positive regard, accurate empathy, and genuineness. By doing this, the client feels accepted by their therapist. In this environment, they begin to value their own emotions, thoughts, and behaviors and are thus freed from their insecurities. The first real alternative to psychoanalysis, many therapists have used this therapy as a base, but have moved onto more proactive forms of therapy. Existential theorists see people hiding behind common interpretations of the world and thus refusing to recognize the responsibility to give meaning to their own lives. Existentialists see people living inauthentic lives because they give the responsibility of defining themselves to society. In existential therapy, people are encouraged to accept responsibility for their lives and their own problems. That is the end of chapter 3. So let's wander in. Let's save it, yes. Now let's go to chapter 4. All right. Let's figure out how to figure these things out. What your problem is. Angela is a 22-year-old who lives with her mother. Angela and Jerry broke up 2 months ago. She became troubled by deep unhappiness and frequent crying spells. She found it hard to concentrate on her job. She had difficulty falling asleep at night. She had a poor appetite. Angela decided to see a counselor. She was referred to Millard Martine at the local counseling center. Millard tried to find out as much as he could about Angela. He sought to accumulate idiographic or individual information concerning his client. Idio means individual and graph means picture, thus an individual picture. Millard discovered that while Angela hadn't ever been depressed this badly before. Miller discovered that while Angela hadn't ever been depressed this badly before, she had periodically suffered from the blues. He diagnosed her with situational clinical depression from the trauma of her breakup and treated her with weekly counseling and maintenance Prozac for her periodic depression. Gaining insight from her counseling, Angela discovered that part of her problem stemmed from a desire to study law and living with her mother. She's now doing law school in Denver and no longer needs any medication. Diagnosis is Greek for discrimination. After the therapist has gathered an accurate understanding of the client, constructed a clinical picture, they will name the client's problem. This is now done so that the therapist can treat the client and receive appropriate compensation from the insurance companies. This is done by comparing the client's symptoms to the symptoms of already established problems. These problems can be found in the DSM-5 and the DSM-5-TR. Classification is part of a process that leads to a fundamental understanding of basic principles rather than just a labeling process. The classification system for abnormal behavior has been based in large part in the manner of the classification for physical disease. A major aim in the development of a classificatory system is to discover to what extent there are distinctive patterns of abnormal behaviors with their own causative histories. The American Psychiatric Association, also known as the APA, along with the American Psychological Association, set up a model called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-1, first published in 1952. The manual was revised in 1968 into the DSM-2. In the process, the number of mental disorders listed was increased by 50%. Both the DSM-1 and the DSM-2 diagnoses were strongly influenced by Freudian theories. There were concerns about the accuracy and the consistency with which the DSM-2 labels could be given. Agreement among clinicians on the use of the label often was no better than chance. Unlike medical diagnoses, psychiatric labels were maintained by consensus alone. For example, homosexuality was listed as a mental disorder until the DSM-2, but it was subsequently removed from the list of disorders as a result of a vote by its members by the members of the APA. The DSM-3 published in 1980 represented a marked improvement from the two earlier systems. Criteria became more objective and behavioral. The largest structural change involved the introduction of 5 separate dimensions or axes in which the individuals could be evaluated in order to give a more complete clinical picture of a person, referred to as multi-axial diagnosis. Axis 1 was clinical disorders and or conditions that may be a focus of clinical attention. Axis 2 were personality disorders and mental retardation. Axis 3, general medical conditions potentially relevant to Axis 1 and 2 listings. Axis 4, psychosocial and environmental problems. And Axis 5, global assessment of functioning. This multi-axial approach continued through the next three revisions of the DSM. The DSM-3R revised was released in 1987. The DSM-4 was released in 1994, and the DSM-4-TR, the text revision, was released in 2000. Now you got to remember that I started studying psychology in 1976. Yeah. Okay, so where does that put me? That puts me in the DSM-2. I was in the DSM-2 when I first started studying psychology. And then they revised it to the DSM-3 in 1980. And then, of course, I've been through all of these other versions. Now, one of the problems with all of this is every time they come out with a new DSM, it changes all of the ways that you diagnose things. It changes the way you look at things. So you can imagine if I started out with the DSM-2, then I went to the DSM-3 and the DSM-3R, and then the DSM-4, and then the DSM-4-TR. You can imagine how many changes have occurred to psychology in the 50 years or so that I've been studying psychology. It's vast. There's a lot. So I don't see any absolutes as far as psychology is concerned. And the reason I don't is because I've lived through all of these changes. Much was altered with the DSM-5, which came out in 2013. The multi-axial structure was eliminated by compressing disorders formerly distinguished as Axis 1, 2, or 3 into a single list. The notion of a spectrum of disorders is now applied to some categories that had similar relatives. Autistic disorder and Asperger's disorder, which was in the DSM-4-TR, and are now autism spectrum disorders in the DSM-5. The DSM-5 remains a categorical diagnostic system. Now we're on the DSM-5-TR. And it's every time a new one comes out, it's a different color. As much fun as that is, the DSM-4-TR is silver. The DSM-5 is blue, I think, and the DSM-5-TR is turquoise, shiny turquoise. It's pretty. However, it includes specific dimensional assessments to quantify degree of symptom severity or to measure personality traits. A level 1 assessment involves a brief survey of 12 or 13 symptom domains rated on a 5-point severity scale. A more in-depth level 2 assessment involves additional checklists and rating scales that are more specific to the issue. In order for a diagnosis to be reliable, different clinicians should come to the same diagnostic conclusion after independently examining the same patient, and this is known as diagnostic reliability. Their agreement on a diagnosis suggests that the label can be applied in a consistent way. Diagnostic reliability can be measured through the kappa statistic. As in correlations, kappa values of 1.0 indicate perfect agreement, and the DSM-3 reliability estimate of 0.70 or higher was considered to indicate good agreement in the use of the diagnosis. An important component of the development of the DSM-3 was the use of extensive field trials to evaluate reliability by having pairs of clinicians make independent diagnoses on several hundred patients. The most reliable diagnostic categories included mental retardation, mood disorders, substance use disorders, and schizophrenia. Less reliable diagnoses included somatoform disorders, factitious disorders, and personality disorders. Okay, so this has been going on for a really, really long time. Lots of disagreement. And for that reason, uh, it's very difficult to find any two psychologists who will diagnose the same person exactly the same. They have a different way of looking at things. And that's okay. That's okay because all we want is for people to get better, right? So it really doesn't matter whether the diagnosis is exactly the same. Now the problem comes that I can only get compensation for my counseling treatment if I can diagnose the patient. That's what the insurance companies want. They want me to tell them what the problem is. Then they will tell me how much how often I can treat the patient and get paid for it. Now I want to help this person. So I need to come up with a diagnosis that will allow me to treat the client and get paid for it by the insurance company. That's the way it works. Okay, so we all have to come up with a similar diagnosis. And that's what the DSM-5 is all about. Well, it's DSM-5-TR right now. Okay. So even if we don't want to put a label on this guy, on this individual, on whoever is having the problem, we don't have a choice. We've got to put a label on him so that we can get compensation from the insurance company. Whether we're a cognitive behavioral therapist or a humanist or a Freudian, we use psychoanalysis, doesn't really matter. The only way that we can get compensated is if we identify them with a problem. We can articulate what that problem is, and that's what the diagnosis is all about. The results of reliability trials were not included with the publication of either the DSM-4 or DSM-4-TR, nor have they been widely disseminated in the professional literature. In an independent study of the DSM-4 criteria for anxiety and mood disorders, this is in 2001, reliabilities above 0.70 were found for all principal anxiety and mood diagnoses except for major depression, which was 0.68, and dysthymia, which is the blues, 0.22. Generally, reliability studies suggested that the DSM-4 diagnoses were at least as reliable as their DSM-3 counterparts. A reliable classification is not necessarily a valid one. Diagnostic validity concerns whether the diagnosis measures what it claims to measure. If diagnoses show construct validity, then the separations between different categories should be discernible. Evidence should be available to support what belongs inside the category, convergent validity, as well as what does not, divergent validity. If a diagnosis was has predictive validity, we should be able to say something about what to expect in terms of outcome, of course. Something just came off the bottom of my computer. Oh no. There is general agreement that the DSM-5 criteria, though far from perfect, makes valid distinctions between different symptoms presentations. These distinctions can also be meaningful in selecting treatment and projecting course of many disorders. However, validity presupposes reliability. The validity of any DSM-5 diagnostic category is limited by the reliability of the diagnosis. This is like arguing about what this and this is the problem with being a psychologist. You put any two psychologists in a room, and they're not going to agree on a whole lot. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that how they see things. If you're a cognitive psychologist, you're looking at brains and brain functioning. If you're a humanist, you're looking at how the person reacts to things. And it's usually it's trying to compare apples and oranges. I mean, you just can't do it. The DSM-5 series is a product of the medical profession and consequently reflects the perspective that psychological disorders should be considered in the same way as physical diseases. Remember, the APA was put together by a by the A, the by the APA, the American Psychiatric Association. Well, psychiatrists are trained as medical doctors, and then they specialize in psychology. So they're trained as medical doctors. And because of that, they see things a little bit differently than psychologists do because they're not trained as medical doctors. They're just trained to help people with a psychological problem. But most of the diagnoses that they have in the DSM-5 are not diseases. At present, I mean, diseases usually have a bacterial or a viral or fungal basis, and of course, none of these do. Depression that doesn't have anything to do with bacteria, viruses, or funguses or fungi. Excuse me. Um, so it gets really confusing because we've got doctors that are trying to make these physical diseases similar to physical diseases, but they're not. At present, there are no medical or biological tests to confirm or verify the vast portion of specific DSM-5 diagnoses. And I worked in medicine for 30 years. I was a laboratory technician, and I was the one drawing the blood, and I was the one doing all the tests. And there are no blood tests for any of these problems. You can't give somebody a blood test and find out if they're autistic or not, or to find out if have schizophrenia, or to find out. The only thing that you can draw blood and find out about is the medication that they're on. How well is their body handling the medication? That's Prozac. You can measure Prozac. You can measure Xanax. You can measure all of your antipsychotics. You can measure all of the medications, but you can't measure how bad their problems are because they're not biologically based. A clinical assessment is the collecting of relevant information about the client in an effort to reach a conclusion about their problem. Psychodynamic therapists listen to their clients speak freely in a process called free association to gain insight into their problem. These psychoanalysts believe that abnormal behavior is caused by childhood traumas that are buried deeply into the unconscious mind. The therapist is only allowed glimpses with free association and possibly in a dream with dream analyses. The interview is the basic, often the only instrument of assessment because the diagnostic criteria of the DSM-5 are based largely on a person's self-report. The general goals include establishing rapport with the client, decreasing the client's anxiety about the process, and collecting some basic details. Formal, structured clinical interviews are standardized interviews in which the diagnostician asks specific questions tied to DSM categorization. Now, I keep talking about all these things, and no, there are no blood tests that work. But obviously, these people have problems. They have too much anxiety. They're too sad, sad to the extent that they're non-functional. Uh, they have they have no concept of reality. That would be schizophrenia. Obviously, they do have problems, and obviously, you need to deal with their problems in order to make them fit back into society. And that's what we're doing as psychologists. We're trying to make people fit back into society. We're trying to take away their symptoms and make them fit back into society. And this is obviously something that we need to do. If somebody has agoraphobia and won't leave their house, they're fairly non-functional. They can't go to the store and buy food. Um, they can't work unless they're working from home, like me. Okay. So you see the problem. The problem is we would love to have a biological structure to this. And because doctors are the ones that came up with all of the criteria, it's a disease model. But there is no way that we can measure the disease of depression, of anxiety, of substance abuse. We can't measure that. Nothing to measure. So we have to look at it as if it were a disease and try to take away the symptoms. I hope all that makes sense. You can reject this whole disease model if you like, but the reality is that in order to treat somebody, you have to give them a diagnosis. You need to label them as having anxiety, as having depression, as having antisocial personality disorder. You've got to label them. It doesn't work unless you do. Then you can't treat them. And if you can't treat them, you can't bring them back into society. The interviewer relies heavily on the accuracy of the person's self-report. Various circumstances can affect what a patient tells an interviewer, the skill of the interviewer, the personal characteristics of the patient, the immediate circumstances and purposes of the interview. Cultural factors can influence the interview process. When the interviewer and the client are of different ages, genders, and/or ethnic origins, bias and misinterpretation of self-report are common outcomes. There is considerable variation between cultures in how psychological distress is described. There are forms of psychological problems that are highly specific to certain cultural groups, and these are known as culture-bound syndromes. One of the most prevalent mental illnesses in Japan is Taijin Kaifusho. 7 to 36% of the population suffer from this. This ailment is a social phobia where the individual is afraid to go out into public for fear of embarrassing themselves or offending others. These individuals have a deep fear of mumbling out loud and inadvertently offending someone. The Japanese are very polite and are very sensitive to shame. Taijin Kaifusho. Amok is a disorder of Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, and Puerto Rico. It is characterized by a sudden, unexplained rage and violence where the individual might injure or kill someone. This is similar to the Viking frenzy of battle they referred to as berserk. The individual may return to normal after the episode is done, and it's known as amok, going amok, running amok. Attaque des nervois, attack of nerves, occurs in Latin America and Mediterranean cultural groups. It is characterized by uncontrollable fits of crying, trembling, and aggressive verbal and physical behavior. The individual may have amnesia after the episode. They have they have rage issues. Dot syndrome is a problem found among men from rural India. These men will forego sleep for fear of having a nocturnal emission. Nocturnal emission is where they ejaculate semen. They will hold their urine for fear of losing semen in their water and limit their ejaculations. These men believe that a man has only so much semen in a lifetime and loses energy as he uses his semen. Blacking out is an affliction that occurs among people in the southern United States and the Caribbean. The individual loses the ability to move, but often can hear what is going on around them. This episode may be preceded by a dizzy feeling, blacking out. Koro is a problem seen in China and South and East Asia. It afflicts both men and women. It is a fear that one's genitals will shrink and retract into the body and cause death. ZAR is a problem that people in North Africa and the Middle East may have. They feel that they are possessed by a spirit that makes them act erratically. They may seem apathetic toward their own survival. Frigophobia is a morbid fear of catching cold or being cold. It has been primarily identified in China and Taiwan. This problem leads people to dress themselves in heavy scarves and coats, even in the summer. Males see being cold as a female attribute and are afraid of losing their masculinity. Susto is a condition peculiar to Latin America where people feel that a frightening experience has caused their soul to dislodge from their bodies and they are living other people's traumas. Symptoms of susto include nervousness, anorexia, insomnia, listlessness, fever, depression, and diarrhea. Voodoo death is found largely in Africa. It is a condition in which people are convinced that a curse has been put on them or that they have broken a taboo. The fear reaction can sometimes lead to uncontrolled sickness or death. Lata is common in Southeast Asia, Siberia, and among the Ainu of Japan. These individuals fall into a trance-like state after they have been startled, such as being tickled or seeing a snake. They may bark, scream, sexually charged statements, or act in a culturally inappropriate manner. Malgry is a syndrome of territorial anxiety identified in Australian Aborigines. Symptoms include headache, abdominal pain, and bloating, and often pain in lower extremities too, sometimes vomiting. The local explanation, it is caused by eating terrestrial food and then going into seawater without washing in fresh water, or eating seafood and then going ashore without washing in salt water, but only if you are not in your own totem zone so that the local spirit does not recognize you, and therefore you get sick. Malgry. Agonias is seen in Portugal and the Azores. The Azores are islands off of Africa that are actually owned by the Portuguese. This syndrome has been identified as an anxiety disorder that includes feeling that there is a physical reaction to a spiritual loss of where they live. Symptoms include a constant burning sensation, loss of breath, hysterical blindness, sleeping, and anorexia. Kufingcesis is a Zimbabwean, a Shona word, that translates as thinking too much. It is mental exhaustion from dealing with problems, thus they become non-functional. This problem is found throughout Africa, the Caribbean, and in East Asia. Kayak angst, some Inuit seal hunters in Greenland experience a feeling of panic while out on the ocean. The individual must ground themselves until the panic subsides. Ghost sickness is found among many tribes, called Tiblotok among the Arctic and subarctic Inuit, and Ik-a, a pattern of behavior similar to amok among the Navajo moth madness. Where in the world did I get this? It is Iso, seen among the Mojave and Apache of the Southwest. Ghost sickness. A form of depression exists among several indigenous people in the Americas, called Wasinko by the Oglala Lakota, and Tawatl I City by the Dakota. It is also seen among the Mojave, the Hopi, the Navajo, the Cree, and the Ojibwe. Depression. A Navajo syndrome, referred to as crazy or frenzy, is characterized by the sudden onset of a high level of activity, such as running, a trance-like state, and potentially dangerous behavior. Okay, you can tell me that these don't exist. That's okay. All right, all right. I don't know where I got these. Must be in the book. Observation is concerned with what persons do rather than what they say they do. Observations made during an interview, together with a person's responses to certain types of questions, comprise a mental status examination which provides a current picture of the person's level of function. Psychological tests are highly standardized procedures for obtaining a sample of behavior from which inferences can be made about the person's general psychological functioning. Psychological tests are usually constructed so that a person's responses can be quantified and compared with norms obtained on a large sample of other individuals. Common psychological tests used for classification include intelligence tests, personality tests, and neuropsychological tests. Intelligence tests such as the Stanford Binet and Wechsler intelligence scales for adults and children are especially useful when there is a question of intellectual disability or when, for some other reason, an estimate of the person's general level of intellectual ability is required. An individual's pattern of strengths and weaknesses across various parts of the tests can provide evidence of specific types of learning disorders, developmental disabilities, neurological impairments, and memory problems. The basic assumption in all projective techniques, which are derived from psychodynamic perspective, is that people will project their own internal dispositions into their responses to ambiguous stimulus materials. Projective techniques are used mainly in an intuitive and clinical fashion by more psychodynamically oriented therapists. These tests, so we talked about intelligence tests. Now we're talking about, we talked about projective tests. We're going to talk more about projective tests in just a minute. Personality tests, these tests are used primarily by clinicians to assess various aspects of personality, such as characteristic motives, defenses, conflicts, self-image, and thought processes. The two most common types of personality tests are projective tests or projective techniques and personality inventories. Projective tests are called projective because the client projects their feelings into the interpretation of the test. The oldest test was developed by Swiss psychologist Hermann Rorschach, and this is known as the Rorschach test. The Rorschach constructed a series of ambiguous ink blots that he asked clients to interpret. He was looking for themes and images in the interpretation. Now clinicians tend to look for various contexts, whether they focus on the dark or the light spaces, do they look at the whole or just parts of the image, do they ignore the different colors or just the dark. This test is primarily used by practitioners of psychodynamic therapy, and this is what a Rorschach ink blot looks like. That looks like Wile E. Coyote to me, the cartoon. Now, these aren't the original Rorschach ink blots because they're copyrighted and I can't get a copy of them. There's another one. This ink blot was created but rejected by Hermann Rorschach. There's another one. Another one that looks like a bug. And another one. Now, if somebody showed you these ink blots and you said, "Oh, okay, that looks like a wolf to me," I just said that. Oh, that looks like two people having sex. I see Uncle Charlie is having sex with one of his nieces. This isn't right. You're projecting what you're thinking. I don't have an Uncle Charlie, so that's okay. This is a bug. Oh, that's the bug. I'm sorry. Well, that's two people. She's an older woman, and she's having sex with a young teenage boy. That may if I come up with an older woman having sex with a teenage boy, maybe this is what happened to me when I was a teenager, that some old lady seduced me or something. That's what the projection. That's what they're looking for. Those types of projections. The most frequently used projective test is a thematic apperception test. This was the Rorschach, the ink blots. Okay, but the thematic apperception test is a little bit different. The apperception means conscious perception. Thus, as the title of the test indicates, the clinicians are looking for recurring themes that seem to be running around in the client's mind. The clinicians feel that clients will focus on one character in each of the pictures, and that person will be the individual who is causing them the most trouble. And this is one of the famous pictures from this is not used anymore. So if you focus on the woman on the bed, or the man holding his hand over his eyes, she's got her arm down. Is she dead? She looks naked. Do we focus on her in the bed, naked, dead, or do we focus on him covering his eyes in anguish? What do you focus on? This is another picture, thematic apperception test. She's obviously in her pajamas. He's all dressed up. Do we focus on him? Do we focus on her? Do we focus on the fact that she's in her pajamas? Do we focus on the fact that he looks sad? Do we focus on the fact that she looks however she looks? It's in the morning, it's in the evening. This is another famous one. This is also not used anymore. It's the older woman saying something to her, to the other lady. Do we say, oh, the mother's trying to tell her not to marry somebody? Is that what happened to us in the past? That's the type of apperception that we're looking for. There's another one. This is a famous one. This used to be a porthole, and then they changed it to a window. There used to be a bottle right here. Is he dead? His arms down, hanging off the bed. Did she murder him? There's all kinds of stuff that you can read into these. And this is one from Central America. We got the drinks all around. Here's one from India. Here's one from India. Why is he grabbing the guy's wrist? Why are they smiling? And this is one from Korea. And I've asked people what this said, and they interpret that as, well, why is he wearing gloves? And I've been to Korea, and if you go to a store, then the people handling the money, the clerks will all have gloves on. But they're usually white gloves. And she doesn't have a nose. It's a little interesting. Okay, so that's that projective test. Although the thematic apperception test, you're trying to create a story, and we're trying to see what you're focusing on in your story about the lady with the dead husband, or the guy with the dead wife, or is that his mistress, or is that his girlfriend? Is that his mistress, or is that his girlfriend? Or is that his wife? Oh my. Is that his mistress or his girlfriend? Is that his mistress or his girlfriend? Okay. Sentence completion test. The client is asked to complete a series of ambiguous sentences. Once again, they are looking for a recurring theme and perhaps a focal figure who might be the author of the problems. For example, I wish I were Uncle Charlie. My father always hated Uncle Charlie. My ambition is to be rich and famous like Uncle Charlie. Women all love Uncle Charlie. What worries me is that I won't be like Uncle Charlie when I grow up. My mother had an affair with Uncle Charlie. You know, okay, Uncle Charlie. Draw a person test, the DAP. Clinicians feel that drawings tell something about their creators. Interpretations involve details, shapes, solidity of the lines, location of the drawing on the paper, the size of the figures, features of the figures, use of background, comments made by the respondent during the drawing task. And that would be an example. That's the that's a dog, I think. Anyway, why is mommy laying down? Why is dad smiling? Why am I so upset? That's a tough one to. There's somebody laying down again. Somebody's dead. Everybody's smiling. The cat's smiling. And that's the famous scream. Um, Edvard Munch is the one that painted the scream. He was coming. It was he's Norwegian, and he was coming across a bridge, and it was in the evening, and of course they had this amazing sunset, and it looked like the sky turned into blood, and people were so amazed. This is from Edvard Munch as well. He did a series of paintings where Edvard Munch never married. Um, I don't know that that's all that important. Anyway, uh, he had lots of models, of course, female models. And he did a series of paintings where the individual, the male, became smaller and smaller and smaller. And here is the first one. The female is, the male head is huge, and the female body is laying over him. And there's the second one. I can't remember what this one's called. Jealousy, I think. And then that one, his head's getting smaller. And that one's called this is called jealousy, and that's theoretically Munch. And here's a lady talking to somebody, picking apples with somebody in the orchard, and he imagines that they're out there, and she, flashes the other guy. Okay, similar situation. This is called The Vampire. She's, I can't remember what this one's titled. Anyway, you can see he's broken up. This is called The Three Stages of Woman. She's a young lady. Here she is, a sexual being, and here she is older. But there's his head right there. This is called Madonna. He's turning into a fetal structure. She's naked. Oh. These are, I don't know if those are sperm or not, but they sure look like sperm. Once the most common form of psychological assessment of projective techniques are now employed less often than other forms of personality tests. The reliability, validity, and usefulness of projective tests continue to be topics of disagreement. And you can look at all this Edvard Munch stuff and go, what does this say to you? And once, if you say one thing to one psychiatrist, they'll say, oh, yeah, okay, that means something. And the other one will say, that doesn't mean anything. It's no big deal. They're just ugly pictures of some kid with his crayons. Anyway, I think Munch is fabulous. A major problem with the psychometric quality of the projective techniques involves the open-ended, unstructured responses that the tests evoke. Personality inventories consist of a large number of statements to which the person is asked to respond in terms of fixed categories such as yes, no, or cannot say. Personality inventories are usually divided into various subscales to measure different aspects of the personality. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the famous MMPI, is perhaps the most widely used personality inventory in the field of abnormal psychology. The MMPI, developed by Hathaway and McKinley in 1943 and revised as the MMPI-2 in 1989, consists of over 550 items covering a wide range of topics, including physical health, religious attitudes, moods, beliefs, fears, and social interests. When the test was developed, the items were administered to 8 groups of psychiatric patients with known diagnoses such as hysteria, depression, and schizophrenia, and a control group of normals. Subscales were then constructed from clusters of test items that distinguished each group, so that a person scoring high on a scale is essentially answering certain groups of questions in the same way as people with certain diagnoses. This gets really confusing because in 1943, we didn't have a DSM anything. So these weren't standardized, but in 1989, of course, we did. But since 1989, all of our diagnoses have changed. The DSM-5 TR is totally different than the DSM-3, and some of the diagnoses have changed. Hypochondriasis no longer exists, by the way. All 3 MMPIs contain 13 basic scales. Hypochondriasis, items showing abnormal concern with bodily functions. Depression, of course. Conversion hysteria suggests that the client may use physical or mental symptoms as a way of avoiding conflicts or responsibility. Psychopathic deviant, repeated and gross disregard for social customs. Masculinity, femininity, people with gender issues. Remember, the DSM-3 still diagnosed people, homosexuality, as a mental illness. All 3 MMPIs contain 13 base. Okay, paranoia is another one. Psychoasthenia shows obsessions, guilt, compulsions, and abnormal fears. Schizophrenia, of course, shows bizarre or unusual thoughts and behaviors. Hypomania shows emotional excitement, overactivity, and flight of ideas. Social introversion shows shyness, insecurity, and little interest in others. The MMPI-2 has become a standard component of personality assessment and psychological evaluations relating to such legal issues as child custody, likelihood to reoffend, and competency to stand trial and insanity. When I was working on my PhD, I had a colleague who was also working on his PhD, and this is what he did. His job was to determine if someone was likely to reoffend, and they were dealing with pedophiles, with rapists, with sexual abusers, and it was he worked with the Ohio um, criminal system, the judicial system. And his job, one of his jobs was to administer the MMPI-2 and interpret it to find out if people would reoffend. Now, the MMPI-2, remember, it's 550 questions. And there are also questions that determine if the person's lying, as interesting as that is. So when he gave somebody the MMPI-2, or it was the MMPI-2 that he was dealing with, he would have to determine if they were trying to read these questions so that they could get out, but they were lying. It was really kind of tricky. The interpretation of the MMPI-2 is more structured than the interpretation of projective techniques, but it remains a complex activity with room for disagreement. Many clinicians tend to use the MMPI in a rather loose fashion, drawing upon their past experience and clinical intuition to make inferences about personality dynamics and psychopathology from a particular profile. Neuropsychological assessments are are techniques designed to provide information about brain functioning and can offer valuable information to the diagnostic process. Some of these assess behavioral abilities to infer neurological integrity, while others involve imaging of the physical brain and its metabolic functioning. These types of tests measure a person's capacities in memory, attention, expressive and receptive language, and eye-hand coordination to indicate whether neurological difficulties should be suspected. The Halsted-Wrighton Neurological Battery consists of a variety of tests involving verbal, auditory, and tactile assessments that gives an impairment index score and allows for comparison of an individual's test results to that of normal unimpaired people. Rapidly advancing technology in brain imaging techniques is providing vast improvement in our ability to observe the structure of the living brain and its function. Computerized axial tomography, the CAT scans, involve a series of x-rays of the brain organized by computers as slices or layers that allow progressive scanning for tumors or other structural abnormalities. Brain imaging is not currently useful for diagnosing an individual with a disorder or for verifying a diagnosis for several reasons. Not everyone who carries a particular diagnosis will demonstrate the same patterns of brain functioning. There are no clearly identified norms for brain functioning in any diagnostic categories. Emotions and other psychological states are not as strictly localized in specific brain areas as once thought. According to researchers and clinicians, members of ethnic and racial minority groups use mental health services less often than members of majority groups. Factors contributing to this disparity include cultural beliefs, language barriers, lack of information about available services, mistrust of the establishment, reliance on traditional remedies, and economic situations. Current research shows minority clients improve the same or less than majority clients, but never more than majority clients. Minority clients tend to prefer therapists who are ethnically and racially similar to themselves. This actually increases the possibility of recovery. Sensitivity to cultural issues increases the possibility of recovery. And that is it. So I'll talk to you again next week.